Hey folks, how's it going? Dr. Spin. Eclectic album reviews and general musical meanderings. Let's talk about Black Midi's Cavalcade. Cavalcade was an extremely hotly anticipated release that came out this last year. Following up a great release from 2018 called Schlagenheim. One of the things that I said about Schlagenheim whenever it came out was that, there's these really great tentpole moments on the album, but there's also the ones that seem to have a little bit less creative energy. I think that that's kind of an unfair assessment looking back on it. It has more to do with songs that are more improvised in their nature and more structured in their nature. The way they come up with the material for their songs is through extended jams. Okay, and so some of these songs previously, I think, were songs that were more improvised than kind of worked out ahead of time. When you record a song that's largely improvised, it becomes fixed, and the expectations of the audience and of the artist kind of revolve around that recording. So one of the things that Black Midi, I think, kind of ran up against after Schlagenheim was made is that those improvised songs started to take on new characters. And the more you get in a situation where you're repeating yourself to try to live up to the original idea of the song, or you're pushing it so far past its original idea that it becomes an entirely new thing. So on Cavalcade, they intended to make an album that had more structure, to kind of to springboard off of the more structured compositions from Schlagenheim. So the ending result is that Cavalcade has a little bit less of the sort of open-ended, improvised feel that Schlagenheim has. Now, I think that Black Midi is an extremely original group right now. Original meaning like what they're doing is a combination of things that really haven't been done in exactly the same way before. Nothing's actually truly original, right? But for me, the big reference point, the big hook for Black Midi last time around was that it felt like they had this sort of creative, aggressive energy that King Crimson has had in their best moments. I'd like to propose 5 ways in which Black Midi is like King Crimson on Cavalcade. Now, the first one is the presence of saxophone. We talked a couple of weeks ago, I was covering King Crimson, about how early in their career, especially in the first phase of King Crimson's work from 68 to 71, saxophone played a huge role. Ian MacDonald and Mel Collins both had a really strong presence on those albums, but it was the most immediate thing that I noticed when their first video came out for this, John L. And John L is, again, I think the L stands for the Roman numeral 50 because he refers to John 50 in the song. Really comes out of the gate as a super hyper aggressive, over the top progressive rock, math rock piece of music. To me, it feels almost like, the surprise that I felt whenever I very first heard Radiohead play Paranoid Android from OK Computer. It's that level of song. It crosses over between alternative and progressive rock. But beyond just the complexity of John L., this phenomenally great, off the chart surreal video.
Creed and gender are abound. Senior kids sing a skits detailing each attendee's sins. The first time anteaters lose themselves in the wings. With vigor they scratch red spots, overwhelmed by their king. In all the world,
for me, John L. feels like the basis of the whole thing is like the middle section of
21st century schizoid man.
It has all these really worked out fast, stop times and really tightly arranged parts. But that sense of structure flows throughout the entirety, I think, of Cavalcade. The second one is the presence of really stirring emotional ballads, especially in contrast with more aggressive parts. As far back as the very beginning, I Talk to the Wind, parts of Starless whenever Wetton was the lead singer, and definitely whenever Adrian Blue came on forward, there were always these moments of these really contemplated, beautifully sung ballads that stood in really stark contrast to the more aggressive moments. That's definitely happening on Cavalcade. John L. is this explosive beginning opening track, and then the second song is virtually just almost like a lounge bar tune. But it doesn't feel like it's such a left turn that it it challenges the identity of the group. It still feels like this album, despite its variety, has a real sense of continuity and a real narrative to it.
As the big curtains open, the last troops running quick for the one and only Marlene Dietrich. She whispers demurely from the Blue Angel, the song we all know, the one that we'd pay for.
Part of that narrative is to keep the listener kind of off kilter, but it still flows really well from beginning to end. And this is something I think that a lot of bands, again, don't do as much as they used to, where, you can have song after song after song that still fits within the identity of the group. But there's a lot of variety. I mean, like, look at a Queen album back in the late 70s. Any one of Queen's albums were extremely diverse stylistically, but still held within the band's sort of mission statement. That's the kind of thing I think that's happening here on Cavalcade. The next way in which Black Midi kind of reminds me of King Crimson centers on Jordy Griep's kind of idiosyncrasies. He's a guy who's created this persona that he sings with. And this doesn't really track so well with like pre-1980 King Crimson, but certainly when Agent Blue came on. Agent Blue is a very idiosyncratic singer, very quirky, kind of absurdist, tongue-in-cheek, never takes himself too seriously, but also is very serious whenever he needs to be. And that's definitely, I think, the approach that Jordy Griep has here. I do think that his sort of extreme vocal style between it was almost like Les Claypool on the one end and Jeff Buckley on the other. The edges of that have smoothed a little bit on Cavalcade. It's like a coalescence of these two extremes. Plus a little bit more of the Jeff Buckley side, certainly when he gets in his more crooning phases on this album. Guitarist Matt Kolonowski-Kelvin had taken sort of a hiatus from the group for a mental health break. So with a group that had come together that was so tight-knit and created their music in such a collaborative fashion, my initial fear was that his bowing out would affect the group's progress. But it turns out that's not the case. Really, what happened is that the other group members of the group kind of stepped up to the plate. Jordy Griep is now the main guitarist for the group, and you really get an opportunity to see how much guitar chops that he has. He sort of hinted at that, I think, some on Schlagenheim, but certainly on this album, you can see him play some pretty technical stuff. And his body language kind of betrays a little bit of discomfort with that, but ultimately his execution and the creativity that he's putting into those parts is work that's easy to overlook in Black Midi is bass player Cameron Picton, because he's, in a way, he's kind of like the John Entwistle of the group. He sings a couple songs that he sings these vocals on, but with such charismatic and active musicians on stage, and he's a little bit more stoic in his performances, and more reserved. So he's got a lot of guts to go up there and sing songs with, after Jordy Griep, who's a very, charismatic lead singer. But I really don't think that reflects on his musicianship, And his bass playing is interesting too, because technically it looks very uncomfortable. He's got a very kind of like rigid forearm, but he plays very fast eighth note lines very aggressively. And again, the part that he plays in the group, both as bass player and as a contributing member, I think is worth mentioning. The next way in which Black Midi is kind of like King Crimson is this guitar line. I mean, that's straight out of the Robert Fripp rulebook, it's especially 1980 on, a really rhythmic, aggressive eighth note lines like that drive things along. And that's Jordy Griep playing that very often while he's singing too. That almost puts him back in that Agent Blue corner. And finally, Morgan Simpson, period. As a drummer, Morgan Simpson really has the kind of chops that Bill Bruford and a lot of the best King Crimson drummers have had. But again, with the kind of energy and the kind of aggressiveness that you see in more contemporary music, almost like Mars Volta. I think there's a lot of crossover between Black Midi and Mars Volta, and Mars Volta's fans will probably like Black Midi. What I think is different about them, though, what distinguishes them, is that Mars Volta took themselves very, very seriously. And Black Midi, although they're very serious about their music and their musicianship, they also kind of cross over into some absurdism that keeps it from being a little bit too heavy, a little bit too presumptuous. Not too long ago, Bill Bruford actually sat down and did a dual interview with Morgan Simpson, and their interview with each other is great. It's phenomenal. Well worth listening to if you're a fan of Black Midi, or if you're a drummer, or if you even are curious about Bill Bruford and what he has to say about contemporary music. There's a lot of really great stuff on that
How long
podcast.
did that take? The
To record.
Yeah.
So we were out in Dublin for maybe 5 or 6 days, and that was to get all instrumentation down.
Wow. That's fast, I think.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. Once we're in the groove, we work really quickly.
But you've been playing the song for a little while before, or not?
Yeah. Well, some of them. So like half of the album is sort of was written towards the back end of Schlagenheim. So sort of like the newer material that was coming out of jams and gigs and whatnot.
Yeah. So they were under the fingers. People knew where the fingers were going.
Yeah, we played them at gigs, and we played them at a UK tour that we did last February, just before Mayhem.
And so you were able to play the song all the way through and get a good take of it.
Yeah, definitely.
Do you realize how old-fashioned that is? That's delightfully old-fashioned.
Really?
Yeah, and you played them all at once?
Yeah, live.
Live with no click tracks?
No click.
Do you realize how ancient this is?
we're old men.
It's really nice to hear. I mean, it sounds
Black Midi started working on Cavalcade shortly after we released Schlagenheim. And unlike a lot of other bands or other projects who go out and write a bunch of music, put it together, and try to craft it and then go into the studio, Black Midi was putting these songs out there, these ideas for these songs out there, very soon after, even during their Schlagenheim tours. They started working on some of this material. So a lot of the music was road tested and worked out in front of audiences. And this is a way of working that doesn't really happen so much anymore, especially in this day and age, whenever it's much more common for people to work remotely, especially after 2020, for people to send files across the internet. And that kind of cuts down on this organic feeling. Well, the good news is that Cavalcade totally has this organic feel to it. It totally feels like a live recording. And in light of that, the amount of chops and the amount of complexity that they're working with on Cavalcade is just phenomenal. It's unbelievable throughout the course of the entire album.
On the works of the pink air passing through new hole on the white rocks of the pink moon.
And there's many more, but that's just 5 ways. And as a King Crimson fan, this is a big hook for me to look at Black Midi. Now, I don't think that Black Midi's trying to copy King Crimson, and I don't think that Black Midi is the next King Crimson. But I certainly think there's enough crossover points in their aesthetic and the way that they attack music in a very open-ended and curious way that is attractive to me as a King Crimson fan. So not to downplay Cavalcade, because I think Cavalcade is one of the most brilliant albums I've heard in a while, and one that no matter how many times I listen to it, it seems to just have new layers, new things that show up all the time. It's initially an impressive and engaging listen, but one with so much things going on and so much to say that it's a long-term listen. I think it's classic. It's like an album full of paranoid androids, and that makes it I think pretty high marks in my book. So Black Midi's Cavalcade, great disc, one of the best albums I think that's come out this year, and creatively one of the best albums that's come out in a long time. Please check it out if you have the opportunity. But that's all I have to say about it this time around. I really appreciate everybody kind of asking me about this album and seeing what I thought about it. I really value that feedback. If you like this video, please like it, subscribe it, share out with your friends. Also follow me over on Spotify. I'll be adding another Black Midi track to my ever-growing 2021 playlist. And I'll see you guys next week. Till then, I'll catch you on the flip side.